I was there the night it happened. The night the cockiest guy in the bar made the biggest mistake of his life, mocking Tom Cruise to his face. He didn't realize who he was talking to at first. He just saw a guy sitting alone, dressed casually, minding his own business. And he assumed, wrongly, that Tom didn't belong there. It all started in one of those upscale bars where the music is just loud enough to make people talk a little closer, where overpriced cocktails are sipped by people trying too hard to impress each other. I had only been there for about 20 minutes when I noticed the guy, let's call him Brad, holding court at the center of the room. Brad had that specific kind of arrogance you only find in men who think their wealth makes them invincible. He was surrounded by a group of equally entitled friends, all of them hanging on his every word as he bragged about his latest business deal, his expensive car, and the women he claimed to have lined up. And then he spotted Tom. Now, Tom wasn't trying to stand out. He was just sitting at the far end of the bar, sipping his drink, lost in his own thoughts. But something about him must have irritated Brad because suddenly the guy was pointing him out. "Hey, check this out," Brad said loudly, smirking. "Looks like someone wandered in from a thrift store." A few people chuckled, but the room had shifted. The kind of shift where you just know something is about to go down. Brad, either too arrogant or too drunk, kept going. "Man, I swear some people don't belong in places like this. You gotta have status, you know? You gotta be somebody, not some nobody trying to sneak into our world." I saw Tom set his drink down, slowly, deliberately. At this point, everyone in the bar was aware of what was happening. Some people were whispering. Others were pretending not to watch, but couldn't help sneaking glances. Tom turned in his seat and looked at Brad. Just looked at him. Not angry, not offended, just calm. And somehow, that silence carried more weight than anything Brad had been saying. Brad, emboldened by the attention, grinned. "What's wrong? Can't take a joke." Tom finally spoke, his voice steady. "You think money makes you better than everyone else?" That shut Brad up. For a second. Then he scoffed. "Obviously, yeah. That's kind of how the world works." Tom nodded like he was considering the answer. Then he stood up, and something about the way he did it made Brad's smug expression falter just a little. "You assume I don't belong here," Tom said, stepping toward him, his movements slow and deliberate. "But let me ask you something. If money is all that makes a person valuable, what happens when it's gone?" Brad gave a short laugh. "I don't plan on going broke, buddy." Tom tilted his head slightly. "That's not what I asked." Now the whole bar was silent. Brad shifted in his seat, suddenly looking uncomfortable. "Look, man, I don't know what point you're trying to make." "The point," Tom interrupted, "is that your ego is built on something fragile. You think wealth makes you powerful? It doesn't. It only amplifies who you already are." Brad blinked. He looked around at his friends for support, but they weren't laughing anymore. "You need people to agree with you to feel important," Tom continued. "But real power? It doesn't need an audience." There was a beat of silence. Then Brad scoffed again, but this time, it didn't carry the same confidence. "Whatever, man. You're just mad because you don't have what I have." Tom chuckled. Not a forced, sarcastic laugh. Just an amused little sound, like he had seen this before. "That's where you're wrong," he said. "I have something you'll never buy. And when you finally realize what that is, you're going to regret all of this." With that, Tom turned, walked back to the bar, and sat down. Just like that. Like Brad wasn't even worth another second of his time. And let me tell you, the silence that followed, it was brutal. Brad sat there, his face red, his confidence shattered. His friends looked anywhere but at him, suddenly realizing that the guy they had been hyping up wasn't nearly as cool as they thought. One by one, they started excusing themselves. A few even nodded toward Tom as they left, as if acknowledging that they had just witnessed something big. Brad? He just sat there, alone. And Tom? He just picked up his drink and took another sip, completely unbothered. That night, everyone in the bar learned a lesson. Some people build their entire identity on the illusion of power. But real power? It doesn't have to prove anything. And Tom Cruise? He walked in as just another guy at the bar, but he walked out as a legend. Brad sat there, his face frozen in an awkward attempt to maintain his composure. But it was obvious. His entire world had just been flipped upside down. His confidence, once unshakable, had been stripped away in front of everyone. And the worst part? Tom Cruise hadn't even insulted him. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a scene. He had just spoken the truth. And somehow, that had hurt Brad more than any insult ever could. The crowd around them had mostly gone back to their drinks and conversations, but the energy in the bar had changed. People kept sneaking glances at Tom, some nodding in quiet approval, others still trying to process what had just happened. I was sitting at a table nearby, pretending to look at my phone, but I was watching everything unfold. And Brad? He was spiraling, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightened. He wasn't the type to take humiliation well, especially not in front of an audience. After a few tense moments, he finally stood up, and then, to my complete disbelief, he started walking toward Tom. I braced myself. This wasn't over. Brad stopped right next to Tom's bar stool, towering over him. "You think you're so damn wise, don't you?" he muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Tom didn't even look at him right away. He took another sip of his drink, then set it down carefully before turning his head to meet Brad's glare. "I think," Tom said, his voice level, "that you're trying to decide whether to walk away or make the biggest mistake of your life." Brad's nostrils flared. "The biggest mistake of my life?" He let out a short laugh. "Buddy, you have no idea who you're talking to." Tom finally turned fully toward him. "I know exactly who I'm talking to." Brad blinked. "Oh yeah, you're the guy who's built his entire identity around impressing people," Tom said calmly. "The guy who thrives on being the loudest in the room because silence scares the hell out of him. The guy who thinks he's untouchable until someone comes along and proves otherwise." Brad's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Tom continued, "And right now, you're standing here because you're desperate to take back control of the situation. Because for the first time in a long time, you aren't the one with power." Brad's face went pale. For a split second, I thought he might actually take a swing at Tom. His fists clenched even tighter, his body tensed, and I could practically see the war happening inside his head. But here's the thing. Brad might have been arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. He knew somehow, some way, that getting physical with Tom Cruise was not going to end well for him. Not because Tom would fight him, but because if he didn't win, it would be the final nail in the coffin of his reputation. His breathing was heavy now. His friends had all but abandoned him, leaving him standing alone in front of a man who had effortlessly dismantled him with nothing but words. Then, in an act of pure desperation, he did something I will never forget. He pulled out his wallet, flipped it open, and slammed a stack of crisp $100 bills onto the bar. "Drinks for everyone," he announced loudly, his voice regaining some of its fake confidence. "On me. Let's lighten the mood, huh?" There was an awkward pause. Some people in the bar exchanged glances. A few hesitated, then murmured their thanks and grabbed a drink. But the energy was all wrong. Brad had spent the entire night acting like money made him superior. And now, he was begging for approval. Tom watched the scene unfold, his expression unreadable. Then, with the smallest hint of amusement, he looked back at Brad. "You think buying drinks or races what just happened?" Tom asked quietly. Brad's forced grin faltered. "No, You think throwing money at people makes them respect you?" Brad swallowed. Tom shook his head, almost pityingly. "Respect isn't something you buy. It's something you earn." Brad had nothing to say to that. And then, before he could recover, Tom stood up. Without another word, he turned and walked away, heading for the exit. Brad watched him go, his expression a mix of frustration, embarrassment, and something else. Something he probably hadn't felt in a long time. Doubt. And here's the thing. As Tom reached the door, he paused. Just for a second. He turned his head slightly and said, almost as an afterthought, "Good luck, Brad." Then he left. And just like that, the man who had walked in as the loudest presence in the room was left standing in silence. Brad stood frozen in place, staring at the door Tom had just walked out of. His carefully crafted world, the one where he was always the dominant force in the room, had just crumbled in front of everyone. And the worst part? No one was rushing to reassure him. His friends, the ones who had been hyping him up all night, had slinked away to different corners of the bar. A few people took their free drinks, sure, but no one looked at him the same way. The laughter that once followed his jokes had been replaced by murmurs. The energy around him had changed. He wasn't the center of attention anymore. He was a guy who had just been wrecked by Tom Cruise. I could see it on his face. He was struggling to process what had just happened. He had spent years building his identity around the idea that he was the one in control, that people admired him because of his wealth, his confidence, his ability to dominate any conversation. But Tom had stripped all of that away in a matter of minutes. And now, Brad was just another guy in a bar. For the next half hour, he sat at the counter, nursing a drink he barely touched. His eyes darted around the room, searching for some kind of validation, but no one met his gaze. It was like he had been exposed, and now people were keeping their distance. And then something interesting happened. Brad left. He didn't slam his drink down or make some dramatic exit. He just quietly got up and walked out the door, his shoulders slumped, his usual swagger completely gone. I don't know why, but I followed. Call it curiosity. Call it instinct. Call it the fact that I had just watched Tom Cruise completely dismantle this guy's ego, and I needed to know what happened next. So, I threw some cash on the table and slipped outside. Brad was standing near the curb, staring at the pavement like he had just woken up from a dream he didn't recognize. His phone was in his hand, but he wasn't using it. He just stood there completely still. And then, for the first time that night, I saw something I never expected to see from him. He sighed. Not an annoyed sigh. Not a frustrated, I can't believe this kind of sigh. A defeated sigh. A real one. I hesitated, debating whether or not to approach him. But before I could make a decision, someone else stepped out of the shadows. Tom Cruise. I nearly choked on my own breath. Apparently, Tom hadn't left the area. He had just been outside, leaning casually against a wall, waiting for this moment. Brad didn't notice him right away. He was too lost in his own thoughts. But when he finally looked up and saw Tom standing there, his whole body stiffened. "You again," Brad muttered, but there was no venom in his voice this time. Just exhaustion. Tom took a slow step forward. "Didn't think I'd still be here, did you?" Brad shook his head, letting out a hollow laugh. "Why? You want to rub it in?" Tom tilted his head. "No, I want to know if you actually heard what I said back there." Brad scoffed. "Oh, I heard you. Loud and clear." But Tom wasn't buying it. "You sure?" Brad's hands curled in a fist at his sides, but there was no aggression in his posture anymore. Just frustration. Not at Tom. At himself. "I don't get it," he admitted, his voice lower now. "I've done everything right. Worked my ass off. Built my business from nothing. Made more money than most people ever will. And still, it's never enough." Tom studied him for a moment, then spoke. "That's because you built your entire identity on something that isn't real." Brad blinked. "What the hell does that mean?" Tom sighed, but it wasn't condescending. It was patient. Money is a tool. Power is a tool. Success is a tool. They can all be used for good or bad. But none of them define you. None of them determine your worth. You did the work, great. But somewhere along the way, you convinced yourself that your value as a person depended on other people knowing you had money, seeing your power, hearing about your success. Brad's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Tom continued. "And tonight, when I didn't react the way you expected, it shook you. Because deep down, you know what I'm saying is true. You just don't want to admit it yet." Brad let out a sharp breath and ran a hand through his hair. "Jesus, man, you're really laying it all out there, huh?" Tom shrugged. "What's the point in sugarcoating it?" Brad let out another laugh, but this time, it wasn't forced. It was real. He shook his head, staring at the pavement again. "You ever feel like you've been running in the wrong direction for so long that turning back feels impossible?" Tom's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Yeah." Brad looked up at him, something different in his eyes now. "And?" Tom's smile didn't fade. "You turn around anyway." Brad swallowed, looked away, nodded once, and for the first time all night, he didn't have anything left to say. The two men stood there for a while, neither speaking. Then Tom patted Brad on the shoulder, turned, and walked away. Brad watched him go. He didn't stop him, didn't call out, just watched. And I swear, in that moment, something in him changed. Brad stood there, staring at the spot where Tom Cruise had just been. He looked like a man who had just been hit by a freight train of self-awareness. And for a guy like Brad, someone who had built his entire identity around dominance and control. That realization was brutal. I wasn't sure what I had just witnessed. The whole night had started as just another display of arrogance from a guy who had too much money and too little humility. But now, Brad looked different. The tension in his shoulders was gone. The smugness, the bravado, it had all evaporated. He was just standing there, thinking. I watched as he finally turned, shoved his hands into his pockets, and walked off into the night, his steps slower, more uncertain than before. And that was the last I saw of him. For a while, a few weeks passed. Life moved on. I went back to that bar a couple of times, half expecting to see Brad there, falling back into his old habits. But he was nowhere to be found. Honestly, I figured he had just moved on, found a different place to throw his money around, surrounded himself with new people who wouldn't question him. But then, something unexpected happened. I walked into the bar one Friday night, the same way I always did, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. The usual crowd was there, laughing, drinking, caught up in their own worlds. And then I saw him, Brad, sitting at the bar, alone. That alone was shocking. No entourage, no loud declarations about his success, no expensive suit designed to scream, "Look at me." Just Brad, nursing a drink quietly, staring at nothing in particular. I watched him for a moment, debating whether or not to say anything. But before I could make a decision, the bartender beat me to it. She walked over and set down a glass in front of him. "You seem different," she said, her tone casual but pointed. Brad glanced up at her, then gave a small, almost self-conscious smile. "Yeah," he admitted. "I think I am." She leaned on the counter, studying him. "Haven't seen you around in a while." Brad nodded. "Took some time off. Needed to reevaluate some things." That caught my attention. The old Brad wouldn't have reevaluated anything. The old Brad would have doubled down, made excuses, blamed everyone else. But this was new. The bartender seemed to notice it too. "You know," she said, tilting her head slightly, "Tom Cruise really got to you that night, huh?" Brad let out a quiet laugh and shook his head. "Man, you have no idea." The bartender raised an eyebrow. "So what now? You just gonna sit here and sulk for the rest of your life?" Brad smirked. "Nah, just trying to figure out what comes next." She nodded thoughtfully. "Well, if it helps, I think a lot of people would rather see this version of you than the old one." Brad's smirk faded into something softer. "Something real." "Yeah," he murmured. "Me too." For the first time, he didn't look like a man trying to prove anything. He just looked like a guy trying to be better. And honestly, that was more impressive than any flashy suit or expensive car ever could be. A few more weeks passed. Life went on. The incident with Tom Cruise had become somewhat of a legend in that bar. People still whispered about it. How the arrogant guy got completely humbled without a single punch thrown, how Tom had walked away like some kind of mystic teacher, and how, against all odds, Brad had changed. And he had changed. It wasn't immediate, and it definitely wasn't dramatic. But little by little, the Brad that used to dominate every room with his ego was gone. He still came to the bar, but he wasn't the loudest guy anymore. He didn't buy rounds of drinks just to prove he could. He didn't shove his success in people's faces. Instead, he listened more, spoke less, actually engaged with people instead of trying to impress them. And people noticed. The bartender, who used to roll her eyes every time he walked in, actually greeted him with a smile now. The regulars, who once tolerated him because he had money, actually seemed to enjoy having him around. He was still figuring things out, but one thing was clear. Brad wasn't the same person he had been that night with Tom Cruise. And then one night it happened. Tom came back. I wasn't expecting it. I don't think anyone was. But there he was, walking into the bar like nothing had happened, like he hadn't single-handedly changed the trajectory of a man's life with a few calm words and a knowing look. He made his way to the counter, took a seat, and ordered a drink, just like last time. And Brad? Brad saw him. For a split second, he froze. I think a part of him wasn't ready, like seeing Tom again was going to be some final test. But then, to my complete surprise, Brad took a deep breath, stood up, and walked over to him. The entire bar went silent. This was the moment. No one knew what was going to happen. Was Brad going to thank him? Challenge him? Apologize? Brad stopped next to Tom's seat. Tom turned his head slightly, meeting Brad's gaze. He didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked like he had expected this. Brad took another breath. Then, in a voice that carried no arrogance, no defensiveness, just quiet sincerity, he said, "I get it now." Tom studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. Brad let out a small, almost nervous laugh. "Man, I was such a—" "Yeah," Tom interrupted, smirking slightly. "You were." Brad chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully fix that." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" Brad blinked. "I mean, people don't really change, do they?" Tom took a sip of his drink, then set it down carefully. "People change the moment they decide to." Brad absorbed that for a second. Then, without hesitation, he held out his hand. Not as a power move, not as a demand, just as a man trying to make things right. Tom looked at it, then after a beat, reached out and shook it. And just like that, the past was gone. No grand speeches, no dramatic moments, just an understanding between two men. One who had once been lost, and one who had simply given him a mirror to see himself clearly. The bar slowly went back to normal. Conversations resumed. Glasses clinked. And Tom, he just went back to his drink. Like always. Brad didn't go back to his old ways that night, or the night after, or the nights after that. Because the truth is, change doesn't happen all at once. It happens in moments. And that night with Tom Cruise, that was the moment that changed everything.